गुड मॉर्निंग एंड वेलकम टू गना शॉट। गना शॉट में आप सबका स्वागत है। टुडे आई हैव विद मी समवन an outstanding Air Force officer, Air Marshal Diptendu Choudhury. And we're going to talk about air power as a component of India's national security. At the outset, this is the first time for a one-to-one between Air Marshal Choudhury and I on Gunner Shot. So first and foremost, Air Marshal Choudhury, thanks a lot for coming. Morning show and great and welcome to Gunner Shot.
Thank you, sir. Privileged to be back with, I think, General Shankar on this. I think incredibly famous. He's famous all over now with Gunner Shot internationally, actually.
Yeah. And look, for all those who are viewing, I'll take a couple of minutes to put things in perspective. For those of you who don't know Air Marshal Chaudhary, I must say he's one of the most outstanding pilots of the Indian Air Force, a fighter pilot who's flown MiGs, Su-30, everything, the works. He's been to RCDS, right? A very intellectual, capable person only can go to the Royal College of Defence Studies in London. And then, of course, he's headed the National Defence College. He's taught the complete next generation of armed forces leadership, including civil bureaucracy, and as also uh, people from friendly foreign countries who come to India, and that's a rare honor, and it's a rare honor for me to host such a person. That's one context. The second context is post Op Sindoor, there's a lot of talk about Air Force and things like that, and Pakistan has gone gaga over as if they have brought down the entire Indian Air Force by claiming 6-0. It's the other way around, the way I look at it, right? And of course, don't forget that there's a 9-0 and 11-0 behind that, right? All the terrorist camps, plus unknown number of communication and all those hubs. And that's the second context. The third context of this talk is that, Air Marshal Chaudhary had a terrific discussion on Klaus channel, and that went viral in Pakistan. And the reactions from Pakistan were quite vitriolic, if I say so. Oh, and I thought he needs to come back and, put out his viewpoint. And the fourth context, which I'm talking of, is this. The concept of air power world over is changing. Once upon a time, we all thought, when you spoke of air power, it is your ability, your fighter ability to go and hit enemy air bases, hit enemy places and cities and all that. Go back to the bombing campaigns of the Second World War. And that was when air power and air forces came into play, Second World War. But today it has changed. You go to space, you have loitering munitions, unmanned missions, you need to have long lift capability, you need to have transport capability, air-to-air refueling capability. You have hepters which have come in a big way ever since the Gulf War. Then these are all complemented by latest technologies, whether you call it AI, you call it networking, you call it everything. So your concepts of offensive air operations, your concepts of your defensive air operations, and many things have changed. Space has come in a big way. People are no more talking of air forces. People are talking of aerospace forces, right? And there are many views about it. And simultaneously, India is also changing, right? There are so many new things coming into the story. It is in this context that I said, look, I'd like to have a thinking flyer, right, to talk about air power and its role in India's national security. With this as a broad introduction, I'll yield the floor to Air Marshal Chaudhary. All yours, sir.
Thank you, General Shankar. It's actually wonderful to be able to share some thoughts on air power, because truly, as we have seen, I mean, in the recent years itself, and as you very rightly brought out, air power has evolved. But in a way, if you really look at it, some of the theoretical construct of the use of the vertical dimension hasn't changed, sir. What is, if you really think about it, from right from Duhe's days when he talked about command of air, essentially air power was a medium which enabled to use the aerial domain to take the fight deep into the enemy territory. And that was the sum total of how it all began. And that's how the bomber campaign sustained. And so, right through the Cold War, I mean, post World War II, the bombers became the strategic air force, to say that, to put it in perspective. And because they are the ones who are doing the heavy lifting, they were the ones who would go all deep into those days into Warsaw Pact territory, and prosecute war from a NATO's perspective and from the US perspective. But over the years, and we have seen in the play out of the role of the bomber in World War II, and I think finally Vietnam, they realized that the futility of bombing cities, the futility of the idea of changing the will of the nation by bombing its people. And historically, they found that the human beings were pretty resilient. At the end of the day, the will of the nation didn't always necessarily break. But what did affect was the war fighting capabilities of an adversary. And air power let you do that. Basically, go deep inside and strike, whereas the surface forces were constrained by what typically, I think, what the army loves to call terrain friction. And so that was the fundamental difference. So, but if you look at it from a perspective, if you look at a Ukraine war, Ukraine and Russia, the Russian use of air power, Israel's use of air power, the US use of air power, the use of air power in the recent conflicts by the nations in a range of conflict scenarios, that is ranging from conventional to the subconventional. What is the common factor? The common factor is using the medium of air to deliver hardware deep inside an adversary's territory. So that has remained. So what has essentially changed is the platform being used, and the means and the ways have expanded to deliver this force, or strategic employment of force into an enemy territory. The targets remain the same. The methods and means have changed because of a variety of reasons. So essentially, if you really look at it, to my mind, this evolution of air power is a natural thing which is bound to happen, and it is not the end of it all. This is what I keep saying, that what we are seeing now with these drones and missiles coming in is again a transient phase of air power. It will evolve into something more. So it'll be simplistic to jump into it that okay, air power has evolved into this is what it is today. No, I'm sorry, air power is continuously under evolution, because your ways and means of prosecuting the aerial medium will expand over time. So that is something we need to really be bear in mind, and I think that is the most important thing we need to look at when we talk about air power and transformation in the modern days. So this is what I would suggest, that that we look at the air not as an end itself. And the problem with the Air Force is world over, and not just in India, incidentally, is this friction between the three services, simply because they all have a long legacy of being instruments of national power. And it so in the past, probably these instruments could work to a great effect, individually, because the terrains were separated from each other. No longer today. So today, I think the most important thing which comes about is the ability of a nation to transpose its will, or affect a change, probably in adversarial behavior, or at least probably shape it or alter it or impact it in some manner, using the instrument of force. And what is important here, that we have to get out of our past legacies, from my perspective, of how we looked at in India, war fighting. And we have to look at it, how does the military, three services come together to provide the best options, the most maximum options to our national leadership in its response matrix. And I think that is the most important thing we should look at in the years to come.
Yeah, I think that they're very valid points which you made. Let me put a few issues across to you. Which I mean, the most important thing which you said is Air Force goes into enemy territory, deep into enemy territory, and does what we have to do. And that's the fundamental thing of a Air Force. And that's a very important characteristic, the way I look at it, because Air Forces by nature are offensive. They're not defensive weapons. If you have a defensive Air Force, it's a result of the other man's offensive only. But at some point of time, you have to go offensive. Without having that capability, that's the fundamental capability of any Air Force. Right. Right. Having said that, let's define, or rather, I would like your views on what is the, before we get into jointness and things like that, since you raised it, we'll talk about it. What do you think would be the role of APA in our national security at this point of time and in the future? How do you see it? And how do you see it vis-a-vis Pakistan? And how do you see it vis-a-vis China?
Yeah. I think that's probably the most pertinent question of our times, because we have seen uh, the way our relationship with the two countries, that we have a distinct, clear, and live continental threat, which is like no other in the world, where you have two borders, live borders. You share borders with two adversaries, direct long borders, and with two hostile countries, and both have strong air forces. So it's an important aspect, because if you look at the Western employment of air power, in most of the places there's been barely any opposition, air opposition. So there's a fundamental difference in our context, because in India you have two adversaries with fairly strong air forces, and their air power is firmly uh, included in their military strategy and the employment of force. So that's something we need to be cognizant of. But in India, I'm afraid, I've mentioned it in the passing in the last talk we had, where I said that, we've not really employed and understood and employed air power in its classical way. And what you said, General Shankar, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said, that air forces are fundamentally offensive. Very interesting aspect today. The word air defense. There are two aspects of, I think, air power which are critical when we talk about as an instrument of force. One is its offensive capability, and other is the air defense. So we tend to look at them as two separate entities, and the inability of an air force to balance both is what leads to probably what has happened in Ukraine. A small air force, not enough, capability, but had to fall back on its air defense system for its survival. Russia, with an enormous air force, enormous platforms, but never used uh, its air force offensively in the manner the West uses it, because it is not there in the Russian doctrinal thinking, the employment of air power offensively in the manner. The Russian doctrine doesn't need large swaths of area to be dominated, or there needs to be control of air over the spaces, and which is what has hurt them now. So the point I'm trying to make is that air defense in our context, and we have seen it in Sindoor, is no longer defensive. The word is actually a bit of a misnomer today. If today I can use my surveillance systems, look well into the adversarial airspaces, deep inside its territory, at all altitudes, and I have surface-to-air guided weapon systems which can fire at long ranges, again well inside the enemy territory, and it covers a vast volume of airspace inside the enemy territory, my air defense is no longer defensive, where I'm waiting for him to come into my territory or my airspace. I am engaging and shooting him down over his airspace, which is exactly what has played out in Sindoor. And very interesting, sir, I must mention to you, I don't think most people are aware. In our new doctrine, we have a chapter called Air Strategy. And in that air strategy, for the first time, a section has been included on no war, no peace employment of air strategy. What should be IF's air strategy in no war, no peace? In that, there are two strong pillars which stand out. One is the employment of offensive air power for punitive targeting, that has played through, and use of offensive air defense, again, to push back the adversarial air force and dominate his airspaces so that it enables you to carry out your offensive missions. So essentially, it's a very synchronized aspect. So these two, you cannot separate the two. So when people talk very loosely about air denial as the future, I'm sorry, air denial is a strategy of the weak, of a nation which does not have a strong air force, which does not have an offensive capability, which falls back on denying its airspace to the adversary to prevent getting hit as much as possible. But that hasn't stopped the Russians from actually hammering away at the Ukrainians strategically. Look at the energy systems, its weapon systems, its industry, its communication systems. In the media which you get, you don't get feedback on the extent of damage done on those things. You only get, people killed because it's very, biased and one-sided media. So the point I'm trying to make is that today, future contours of air power, one aspect will remain common, is the fact that offensive capabilities, if you look at it, air defense efficacy in Sindoor prevented enemy offensives to come in. We managed to stall them and stop them and shoot them down. But what brought them to the table was our offensive capability. And that is an important lesson we tend to forget in this, I would say, a slightly overly displaced focus on air defense.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point you made. That look, in Op Sindoor, what came out is that the Indian Air Force was offensive by nature, prepared to go into the depths of Sargodha, and now it's coming out even Kirana Hills, right? And whereas the Pakistani Air Force was completely defensive, it was pushed back to being into defense. In fact, I don't think it ever ventured to come this side. Whatever it tried was probably a bit of a show, and that also flopped. So in this context, I'd like to discuss a little about Pakistan and its Air Force and its legacy. Uh, as we were discussing just before we got live, you were mentioning that look, Pakistan Air Force is basically a defensive Air Force. It is defensive by nature and defensive by tactics and defensive by mentality. Would you like to highlight this in the historical context and connect it with what happened in Op Sindoor?
So Pakistan, I won't say it's okay. If you want to put things in correct perspective, I will put it this way: air defense is the most central role of the Pakistani Air Force, defending their nation, defending their Air Force, and defending the military as well, to whatever extent it can. But it has focused on air defense because it realized long back that always the Indian Air Force has outnumbered it in terms of size and capability. Our offensive capability in 65 and 71 war and in Kargil, in fact, there is this lady, author called Naseem Zahra, who's written on the Kargil, on the coup on the Kargil. Yeah. And she mentions in that the impact the role of offensive air power had on the troops in the hills, in the Pakistani, the NLI. But what is important is that they saw the damage and the ability and the fact that we actually operated offensively in their airspace for the longest time, whether it was all through 65 war or all through 71 war. Not too many people know that in 71 war, in the Eastern Front, we had catered for, that time, I think Air Chief Marshal P.C. Lal had come out with a brilliant targeting strategy. I think, he's one of those undersung strategists of the Indian Air Force, where he said, we will attack Pakistan in target systems. So there was an entirely separate air strategy for the Eastern Front, which revolved around getting air superiority quickly and giving full support, offensive support to the Indian Army. That was the primary role in the East, which we achieved very quickly by 3rd of December in 2 days' time. And
we were there.
We had actually total air superiority. On the Eastern Front, it was different. The national military strategy was, I will say, to hold off the Pakistani, because that famous offensive strike of Pakistan, General Khan's, that that he will cut through India, and the defense of East Pakistan actually lay in the west. Was
lies in the West. Yeah.
their overarching strategy. But that failed simply because every offensive you see, even in 71, at least there were 3 major offensives which were stopped by air power. So they realized this. And in PC Lal's strategy on the Eastern Front was entirely different. He says, we will hit Pakistani target system. One is energy system. One was a communication system. That means road, railway line, bridges, marshalling yards. That was the second thing. Third thing was hitting their air system. That means pushing the PAF back, hitting their forward airfields so that they are forced to withdraw to the depth airfields, which enabled us to operate and come in support of the army inside Pakistani TBAs. So willy-nilly, what happened by the second, within the first week itself, Pakistani Air Force fell back to their depth bases, and we actually ended up getting air superiority, which we hadn't planned for, which we had planned only for favorable air situation. We ended up getting air superiority to almost 100, 120 kilometers along the river road railway line axis running from north to south. And this is acknowledged by Pakistani authors. So the point I'm trying to make is that Pakistan has been always predominated in their thinking from a defensive mindset. China, interestingly, also has been a defensive force. Its air force has main role through the large part of its time was main security, air defense of the mainland. It's only in the post-Gulf War, in a systemic manner, they have chosen to expand their air force and now increasing the offensive capabilities. PAF, on the other side, despite being air defense oriented, believed in this, there was this whole ethos of preemptive strikes which came up from the Israeli wars. And that sort of took the fancy of the world, that, preemptive strikes showed you how aggressive you were and, what outcomes air power could. Fair enough. We were restrained. We didn't, in fact, act proactively because nationally we have never done. We have always hit back after being hit. So the advantage has been Pakistan in the preemptive strikes, but that's about it. After the first few preemptive strikes, what happens thereafter in the rest of the war? Look at 65, 71, Kargil and Sindoor.
Op Sindoor.
At the end of the day, they fall back, and it is Indian Air Force's offensive ability which prevails and creates long-term strategic outcomes. That is what the key aspect is, because that is the difference which Pakistani Air Force chooses to ignore when it talks about its competition and constant tussle with Indian Air Force, its adversarial aspects with the Indian Air Force.
Yeah, I also find, something very funny about Pakistan. Pakistan's thinking of Air Force seems to be revolving only around fighter aircraft and nothing beyond. Fighter operations are for it the defining thing, because you see in this case, well, a lot of hype which has been built up internationally is about their, hype, about their imaginary downing of 6 Indian aircraft. But what about the other components of air power? There's so many other components of air power which just failed. And at the end, on 10th morning, they were down and out. And that's why they ran. So I think that's a problem. And look, that's my view. And you could say yes or no to it. I'm sure you'll give a better understanding of that. The second issue is, how do you think, like China, you did mention, China is now thinking of an offensive orientation, especially along its mainland. What do you think its orientation will be along the LAC, given the fact that it doesn't have the capability to go that offensive? In terms of terrain.
In terms of terrain, got you, absolutely. So one quick summary of the Pakistani Air Force, like, what you said, the thought. Yes, you're absolutely right. It has elevated its stature in the world on the basis of its air combat kill record through history. They take a lot of pride, which is, I grant that Air Force, it's a professional Air Force. They've gone and flown with a lot of air forces in the Gulf, and they've fought against the Israelis, they fought against the Russians, and they have a fairly vast combat experience. So there is no denying that. But role of an air force to a nation is not just about shooting down the adversary. It's about using the aerial domain to assist the larger military instrument to achieve national goals. It is not just about pushing or fighting and holding off the adversarial air force. It's about contributing to the war effort in a much larger way, which I don't see Pakistan having done in the manner the image it has created of itself. So, if you look at strategic outcomes of wars and the role of PAF, you will find at the end of the day, PAF's had role other than its air combat role, which is what it likes to talk a lot about. Its offensive role, what has it done? What harm has it created to the adversary? What destruction and damage has it caused? That is something which they don't talk much about. So we will, because for obvious reasons, I don't think there is much in the history they can talk about, frankly. Other thing is when we get down to China, Chinese Air Force from legacy was a huge Air Force, one of the largest Air Forces in the world. Very interestingly, from Mao's days onwards, to a certain point, they considered their numbers as a deterrent capability in itself. So, which if you really see, in a way, held true in 62 because the US advised us that the Chinese Air Force, and they had fought with the Chinese in Korea, and they had a fair amount of experience with the fighting the Chinese and the Russians who were helping them. But that's when they realized that this large force had actually not really served its nation other than in its numbers. So from after Korea, the only time the PLAF, the PLA Air Force, went into some operations was very limited in Vietnam, but that also an air defense role. It has never carried out offensive air support for its army. It has never carried out offensive roles. That is the Chinese Air Force historically. And most of its roles, even in, that post breakup with when it became the US forces were fighting the Chinese in the South China Sea. So it was essentially all air-to-air fighting. But in Gulf War was the real eye-opener for the Chinese. And I mentioned this. There's this book called Unrestricted Warfare written by the two PLAF colonels.
Yeah.
Interestingly, PLAF colonels. So, but they make a mention that they watched the Gulf War very closely. They saw the effects of use of air power, its capabilities, and the use of space and the vertical domain. So these are the two lessons they took away. And if you look at it, I have gone through their entire list of white papers and I've studied it at length because of part of my research. If you see all their white papers, in every white paper, whatever is written as was the goal or the achievement objectives of that white paper for that period of time for the PLAF has been systematically met. Very beautifully planned strategically on the build-up of air forces. So now what do you see? From a large number and huge air force of legacy systems, today, more than probably 50% of their aircraft, more than 50% definitely are fourth generation plus. A fairly large chunk, 30%. I mean, that's just rough ballpark figures off the back of my head. The actual figures would be probably more specific. About 30 to 40% are 4.5, 5th generation platform. They are building offensive capabilities. Now, why is that? Because they realized defending of the mainland was not good enough. As their maritime capabilities increased, they wanted to push the US out of the first island chain, definitely in the South and East China Sea and including Taiwan. And the ultimate goal is to push them outside the second island chain as well. Because till now the US carrier fleet has been dominating in the region for a very good reason. Enormous maritime power and enormous amount of air power on the two carrier groups, which threatened the Chinese mainland. So strategically, if you look at, they went into what the Americans, it's an American term, that anti-area access denial. But their whole aim was to deny the adversary access to their mainland.
Yeah.
What did they do? They used the Navy, pushed them out. They in South China Sea, they built some 8, 9 islands, out of which 3, Fury Cross, Mischief, and I think Gavin Kuaton or Gavin Creek, I forget, have full-fledged airfields. Between each airfield can take in about 100 platforms. They got sensors there. They got SAGD SAM systems, and they are well out into the sea. So what have they done? They have used air power now to push their weapons there, push the envelope out further for the Americans. So what did they do? They dominated the maritime space. Now they use the PLF to dominate the airspace above them. You look at how they're using the PLF over Taiwan. Initially, in I think 2007 or something, 14, if I forget the date exactly, when they tried to enforce the ADIs, they declared the ADIs in the East China Sea. But they couldn't enforce it because they didn't have the capability. Today, they are flying over 50 plus aircraft missions, composite missions, offensive missions, with strike aircraft, air defense, EW escorts, air defense escorts, jammers, early warning aircraft in large packages over Taiwan regularly. They violate the median line between Taiwan and China with impunity. So they have actually erased the salience of the median line
Median
between
line.
them. So point which I'm trying to make, that PLAF is now increasingly using its Air Force offensively and building offensive capabilities. But its primary focus of its offensive capabilities is still against Taiwan and the US and the threat in the South and East China Seas. In the north, from us in Tibet, you're aware, I think all of us are aware, they're constrained by the altitude of the airfields, but they are rapidly building an infrastructure. They didn't focus too much on the TAR for PLAF infrastructure development for several decades because the focus has been on their eastern seaboard. But now they've realized with India's threat, and they learned the lessons in Galwan and Doklam. Both these, what actually worried them was the speed at which the Indian Air Force spun up its offensive capability and operations, which they didn't have a counter at that point in time. So in Tibet, air forces, platforms, they come in on seasonal deployments, which they have started. We have increased in larger numbers, but there are huge restrictions on them still because of the altitude of operations. So they have very little offensive air capability in Tibet. They compensated for it using the rocket force as an offensive substitute. Ideally, it should have been a mix of both, but we find it is essentially rocket force there because that is the only thing which it can use offensively at this point in time. So till they build up the entire Air Force, but the speed at which they're developing is also important. We still have the advantage, but not for very long out there. So what have you seen in the past? If you see in the border crises, it was only about surface movements. But notice they wanted buffer zones. See, in the air, buffer zone means, okay, whatever you choose a certain area on ground in which both sides respect. But the danger here is if you extend the buffer zone vertically, you are denying yourself airspace and sovereignty to operate your APA up to the clearly defined area territories which are ours. So there's a challenge here we need to bear in mind. Till now, the PAF has not been PLAF has not been very active on the borders. But post Doklam and all that, we saw they started whenever they deployed there, they would carry out some missions along the border. That you will find in the future will increase. So the vertical domain will be an additional factor which you must factor with the Indian security and environment, and the security thinkers must include in the narrative that tomorrow there will be air power pushes against our sovereignty as well. It will not remain only on the surface. So we have to look at it entirely in a holistic manner. So that is the important thing. As I see it, most certainly China will have 6th generation fighters in Tibet. They already have deployed 5th generation fighters. They will have 6th-generation fighters operating in Tibet before we even get our 5th generation. Pakistan will also have a 5th-generation platform. That is the concern. That is what we
Yeah.
need to bear in mind, that technologically we are being disadvantaged, and our capability, and more importantly, the capacity is shrinking.
Yeah, that's an important point you made. Our capacity is shrinking. Uh, and this is not only what you're saying, it's not a state secret, it's an internationally well-known thing. Or do you think we'll be able to make up given the problems we are having and our roadmaps and funding and technology and all that? How do you think we should navigate our future? Because that's one part of the story. The second part of the story is, look, we can talk of fourth, fifth, sixth generation aircraft. At the end of the day, what matters ultimately is how useful are these? Because the difference between fourth, fifth, and sixth generation, they're marginal in nature in terms of many things, right? And these are untried, untested systems, never tested in battle. So, how your views on both these, our own programs and these generations? Because, to be very honest, I'm a little skeptical about them because they've not been tested.
Uh, you make a very interesting point on this, but first let's cover the our numbers issue. Uh, Simply put, I think that is something which had been staring us in the face for 2 decades, and we let it slip. You can keep going back into the past and to who was
Yeah,
responsible.
that's
But the fact is, we are where we are, and the irony is, we had seen it coming, and we let it happen. So let's put that aside. Today, our indigenous capability to produce fighters of consequence which will be future relevant, we are still some distance away from the technological wherewithal and capability. Engines, for example, remain our uh, the biggest
actually
Achilles.
theory.
Absolutely. So you can't just produce a platform unless and until you have certain core technologies available to you. That is in the making now. But by the time we build up and develop our own future relevant fight, which we have pitched a lot our weight on the AMCA program, what we need to bear in mind, and this drive towards Atmanirbharta and self-reliance, you have to remember one aspect, and that is something you need to consider very carefully, that the Atmanirbharta in certain high-tech areas is a long-term strategy, where you have to build up the research base, build up the developmental process, get into what should I say, strategic partnerships for niche technologies, build your own, and reach a capability where you can produce state-of-the-art platforms. That is minimum a decade plus away. So what do you do in this period? Can the Indian industry cope and deliver and fill your gaps? I'm sorry, no. And that's it doesn't need rocket science maths to figure that out. If you see, we're just retiring the last lot of MiG 21s. We'll be down to the lowest ever figure we have ever been in numbers. We have never hit these numbers before. So where today it's not a big bazaar you can go and buy with a cart and say, give me 2 dozen of these latest fighters. Wherever you get the platforms for, there's a production line. There's a demand on that production line, especially if it's a foreign aircraft. The point is, how do you fill this 4+ generation gap? Because another large lot of a fighter fleet will, in the coming decade, by about 2030 or so, will come up for sort of retirement.
Retirement. Yeah.
MiG 29s, the Jaguars, these are the fleets which we will have to start replacing. How do you do that? Can your production take care of it? HAL promised 8 aircraft. Forget about the quality of the platform. It is still not delivered the required specific standards which we have asked for the Tejas 2. That with the advanced engine. So that's even some. So the point is, what we really want is still not there with the Air Force, and it will not come at the rate which you need. 8 aircraft. It's a 16 aircraft makes a squadron. China produces 100 aircraft in a year. So unless and until we build up our production scale to a capacity of at least 2 squadrons in a year, we are a long way off. So that capacity building will take time,
Yeah.
3, 4, 5, 6 years. So the sense it would be that you have no choice and come to terms with the fact that you have to buy how much ever hate the whole idea. You have no choice but to do a certain amount of buying to balance it. Again, we have fallen to the trap, but we have no choice.
Yeah. I think so. That's a fairly given that look, you need a certain amount, you can max produce so much. The balance you have to buy is a given. But in the interim, is there a case for us to up our number of missiles and the missile systems which we have? Because the way what Op Sindur has taught us is that look, you might not have aircraft going across, but your missiles will go through. So, is there an interim way of handling this? Because that is one technology which you own, you have.
You know, okay, I'll just finish with what another part of the previous question which you asked, that your little skepticism about new age technology platforms because of their being untested. Irony is, we are tech buffs, especially in the military.
Yeah,
So, moment we see technology, and especially in the younger generation, which is so tech savvy, it's almost like they are having a passionate affair with technology and cannot accept anything else. So, so we get carried away by technology. But the hard reality of it is technological changes have always been there in war fighting and military and history. What we are seeing now is what possibly our uh, predecessors did with a new technology of its time in their time.
yeah,
And that is how, when probably Duhe came out with his command of air, they looked at air power as a holistic answer to everything, which it wasn't so. So the point I'm trying to make is that our adversaries and our threat situation in India, which is pretty unique, will need a fair amount of our conventional forces, which are there presently with us. That's a huge number. So technology can only be added in a certain quantum. It cannot change this entire range. So I have a problem when people talk about, oh, do we need fighters anymore? Do we need tanks anymore? Do we need aircraft carriers anymore? I don't think we can look at extreme ends of either this or that. What you mentioned, missiles and rocket, most certainly we need to look at today a force in being with
a jump.
every possible element and instrument of force which is available with our means, which we can use to some effect. You cannot get the
Yeah,
perfect weapon in numbers that you want. Most of your war fighting will be carried out with the weapons which are already there with you, older technology, but that's the bulk of your forces. So modern air forces today have fairly large platforms which they are upgrading. Why is it that there are three lobbies which are building on this fifth generation aircraft? China is into the sixth, the US is into sixth. So why is that still there? Despite all the drive and thought, and everyone's watching the present day war, it is simply because that remains, man platform still remains a it
import.
wasn't the only, it has become
Oh, yeah. It's one of the
option.
major components. No, it's one of the
Absolutely.
major components. There's no doubt. You
But the
can't have
stealth,
a one-sided thing. You can't have a
absolutely.
one-sided force where you have only loitering systems, only missiles, or only guns, or only aircraft, or only everything. You need a mix, a happy balanced mix of everything. And my way of looking at it is in a very simplistic manner, which you actually echoed is okay. At this point of time, you don't have something, you offset it by something else, and you have different hedging strategies, right? And you need to open up your own strategies for the future and go ahead. I mean, I don't think we can be static, and nor can we think that we are at a disadvantage. And that's my viewpoint, right? Now, consistent with all this is a matter of funding also, because you need to fund all these. High tech is very good, but it's costly and it's unreliable. And let me give you a very fundamental view of mine. In the high altitudes in which we fight, technology has its limits. Beyond
Absolutely.
a point, technology doesn't work in those high altitudes, right? And if it doesn't work for us, who we operate from a relatively lower technology, what would it be for the past?
Challenges.
You can get sixth generation, but Tibet is Tibet, and Tibet has its own dynamics, right? And where you need a runway here in Ambala for 2 kilometers, there you need a runway for 4 kilometers, and that has its own dynamics. I'd like your little views on this, which I've spoken, and then we'll take questions.
Absolutely, bang on. So this is something which I write about a lot. That our threat perception today is so varied. You look at the northeast, dense jungles, adverse weather, hills, which I think has been the burial ground of so many aircraft from the World War II days, crossing the hump.
Yeah,
The challenges there. So it's a huge challenging terrain. The entire northeast. If you look at the entire Himalayas, like Kaplan's brilliant book, The Revenge of Geography.
and geography. Yeah,
Geography rules there. Geography rules there. You look at Kashmir, or the northwest. Look at Punjab, entirely different terrains, deserts, maritime terrain. So can we have a force which or expect operations in each of these areas to be similar? Each area will have an entirely different dynamics. So when it comes to force application has to be tailored specific to the requirement of the altitude and the context there. Like in what you mentioned in China. I will make an interesting point here. You look at why you mentioned stealth. Why is US laying so much of emphasis on stealth and ability to penetrate air defenses? Because its air power, it's its truly offensive capability in the maritime domain, which it has to breach the A2AD, anti-area access denial of China, which is a mix of the maritime and the aerial domain.
yeah,
Both the Navy and the PLAF are hugely invested in the anti-area access denial. So it's a very dense lethal system. So US needs it desperately to penetrate these systems to create any offensive targeting. Because if you don't do any offensive targeting, you can't impose your will. That is why there is so much of emphasis. In our case, in Tibet, the entire maritime version, the maritime element of defenses are not there.
there. Yeah,
So it is a very limited air defense capability in a terrain which is impossible to cover in with this air defense in a manner which you could do in the planes. So there's a huge challenge. So Indian Air Force still has a huge advantage there.
yeah.
And
I complete. In fact, let me pick up something which you have said.
if
It
there's
just
one
struck
thing we
me.
learned very hard and quick, yes. So post Kargil, we learned the importance of reviving our because we realized with the northern adversary, high altitude operations is that's what it's all about. So
Yeah,
a lot of our focus in our training, tactics, concepts of operations are to cater for it. And this is where I keep, when we discuss with the army counterparts, I said, this is where you need the Air Force the most. Not only to keep his air power at bay, which it is very more reasonably done, the interdiction battle at the depths in Tibet, hitting his communications, logistics, movements, armor, C2 nodes is the most important thing because that is what will drain him out or put pressure on his front line, on his tactical battle spaces and give the Indian army the much needed space it needs to operate.
yeah. I think that's very important. In fact, one point which came to my mind as you were speaking, especially in the Northeast, the jungles, terrain, and all that. What many people don't realize, and I'd like your view on this. You see, the Himalayas and the Northeast are a funny combination. North of the watershed in Tibet, it's all bare open land, where your orientation as a pilot would be far better than, you know, when you get out of our jungles. And for the Chinese guy who has to come from the other side and into our areas, The moment he crosses the front line, it's all jungles, thick jungles. And he has to operate in a jungle terrain. I, I mean, I wonder how many of us realize that this terrain differential is huge. It's a huge disadvantage for the Chinese. Your view on that, because I picked it up exactly from what you've spoken. And I think everyone should understand this.
You know, interestingly, I've been writing about this, and I have said that, high altitude training is what the PLA is doing, a lot of it, and like you said, its ability to maneuver and operate conceptually as a military in its force application. Those dynamics will end the moment they hit the jungles. So the story is entirely different. And here I think the Indian Army has got an enormous advantage is the sheer extent of experience and capabilities it has in jungles, in mountains. You look at it, it is something which we actually, I find this, I mean, it's in the Air Force, I'm sure it's in the Army, we underestimate ourselves a lot.
Yeah, I
Actually, we
agree
are
with
an
you.
enormously capable, trained, experienced military. We sell ourselves short by making, or talking about the West all the time. The fact is, we have prevailed in every war till now, except 62, and that was an entirely different set of
Different story.
and which I think if we had air power, offensive air power, in the story would have been ending would have been different. Certainly, it wouldn't have been what it ended at. But what you say is very important, that the dynamics of the battle spaces there are, I would say, today, if we can really come, put our heads together from a larger joint perspective, there is so much. It's an entirely different kettle of fish. It is not as bad as people in the media makes it out to be. Let's put it this way.
No, no. I mean, I have a different view altogether. I don't think the Chinese have that capability. It's a matter of people. It's a matter of, again, it's just not a matter of the Air Force. It's a matter of the Air Force with the Army. Both complement each other. That this complementarity which we have is too lethal for PLA. I am very clear of that. I have no doubts about it. But I thought I'll put it across the air aspect of it. And it's for all of you who are seeing this, please understand what the Air Marshal said. The capability of the army is phenomenal, and it just force multiplies what the Air Force is going to do, and vis-a-vis, and vice versa, right? It's not easy. And I'll give you my own personal view. I'm not a flyer, nothing, but there are places in the Northeast where we have to air deploy guns. The valleys are so narrow in that the aircraft or helicopters can't go and even turn around. There's no space. And if a helicopter with an underslung gun can't go into that valley, deploy and turn around, just think. Do you think a fighter which is flying at 1 Mach can do any maneuver there? Can he do any targeting there? He will just fly over you without even understanding where you are. And I am sure, this is my sense. I'd like this flyer to tell me this. Yeah, all yours. On this one issue, which is on ground problem.
You are aware, sir, being in certain institutions where we've worked on these kind of things precisely for a long time. I'll just leave it at this to say that if anything, I think the Indian Air Force uses geography phenomenally to its advantage in that terrain.
Yeah.
And that is something our skills and expertise in operating in high altitudes, in valleys, in the kind of actually air to ground targeting, the amount we do, it's way different from the PLF. So experience wise, I think we are enormous. We are an entirely different Air Force in terms of capability, and we have seen what our offensive capabilities can do. So in a terrain which I think where the traction is so much, the movement of forces are limited. It's a beautiful target rich environment for hitting, what they call as interdiction heaven. I'll put it this way. So that is something Indian Air Force is very acutely aware. I think in a lot of our commands, the joint thinking, the targeting lists, and all that take all these factors into consideration. So I
Yeah.
think we are in a different space from what we were in the past. The problem happens in the veteran community. A lot of us are stuck in some of our past
Asked.
legacies and concepts, uh, not keeping, and I don't blame them, but not keeping up with what are the latest, what happens in the latest way of doing things. But I think the younger generations get it. They adapt much more. Their minds are much more
Yeah.
laterally oriented. They absorb technology, and they don't have as much of baggage which our generation had, very frankly.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so. I think we've had a terrific conversation with your thing. I'll take a few questions because we'll just take two, three important questions, which so that everyone understands. The first question, which I thought is important for everyone to understand, is has the concept changed from air superiority to air dominant, or is it aerospace dominance?
Oh, fabulous question. In fact, I was wanting to bring this up at some point, and I think it slipped my mind. First thing is, I'll put it this way. What is important is control of the air. That there was some thought in between, oh, that control of the air is no longer going to be relevant in the future, but it's a fact. It's important in Russia. It's happened in Iran. What the US and Israel could do was simply because they owned the airspace. Air superiority is the ultimate expression of what should I say, control of air, where do you have practically air supremacy, I'll put it, where you have practically no air opposition. Air superiority is where you may have air opposition, but it doesn't impact your air operations. Notice the degree of extent of control. Then comes favorable air situation, where you don't have the control of the entire airspace all the time, but you have a control of air over defined airspaces for a defined period of time. So all these different states of control of air supremacy, air superiority, favorable air situation, and air dominance. Air dominance is a little more open-ended, but these three essentially are degrees of control of air which depend on the enemy air opposition. So if you have a strong air force, then you will have a contested airspace, much more number of contested airspace. So air superiority has to be really fought for, and it is very difficult. So in Indian context, and the way we see it with the present force levels, favorable air, while we would desire air superiority, practically favorable air situation is what we work with, and that is what we trained on. So this is
Yeah.
what I wanted to bring about, that it is important that this aspect will continue to play an important role in the future and in the years to come.
Yeah. The next question is, do you think modern improved air defense has put severe constraints on any Air Force's offensive capabilities? And how does one improve this going forward? While the question is relevant, I'd also like to point out beforehand, look, it didn't stop us from doing what we had to do in Operation Sindoor, right? Yeah.
So I think I mentioned a part of it when I talked about offensive air defense conceptually in the beginning. And I think in India, what we have today, we have an integrated air defense system because of the kind of weapons that we have, sensors and shooters. It is an extended integrated air defense system which looks into the enemy airspace, amply and adequately, which is what enabled to keep the PF at bay and yet carry out our own offensive operations. So I don't think it puts severe constraints. If anything, improved air defense, and like I said in my favorite use of terminology, offensive air defense adds to our offensive capabilities. And offensive air power and offensive AD are like conjoined twins. You cannot do one without the other, and they are the most critical factor in the future. And this is what will happen. So initially, like I see, there'll be probably a large number of standoff targeting at some point, but every country has limits of weapons and target systems and defenses. So at some point, yes, there will be what we call stand-in attacks, where fighters at a later stage, where we will be able to, where the enemy air defense would have been degraded, where fighters will be able to go deep inside and carry out its attacks, even with standoff capabilities, but with greater impunity than in the probably beginning of the operations. So I don't think it will put constraint. If anything, it will expand the offensive capabilities. And if you dominate an adversary's airspace offensively, you can use your offensive capability with impunity.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Sanjay, for joining us as a YouTube member. Thanks a lot, Geet, for your contribution. And thanks a lot, Saurav, and for your comment that listening to distinguished sirs is always an honor and pleasure. Thanks a lot. I have one last question, which I thought, let me put across to you. Wait. Yeah. This is the last question we'll take on. Why are we worried about the fifth generation J35 when it's not even fully inducted into PLAF? Will I'll expand this question a little more. Is that look, uh, like we did handle this question. The Marshal did mention about all this in his talk. But specifically, are we really worried about J35 the way it is made out? That's the fundamental question.
There's a every platform which is an improvement on the past with newer technologies, and nowadays with this with this moniker that we use, fifth generation, sixth generation. Like you said very rightly, what is it? It is essentially minor or maybe significant improvements on previous technologies, which gives a greater survivability, greater invisibility, greater penetration capability, greater weapon carrying capability, making the platform more effective, more agile, and more capable. But there's a danger in this, because at the end of the day, it's an aviation industry. So marketing is an important aspect. And I think
Big money is there.
a lot of platforms fall victim of marketing. Look at the F-35. The amount of challenges it has gone through in its development is incredible. I mean, it caused even Elon Musk to call that the people who design continuing with this aircraft are idiots. I mean, to make a statement to that level. But the point what I'm trying to make is, like, for example, the Rafale. We hyped it up that this is the be all end all. No, sir. Every platform brings a certain set of capabilities. While there is a huge amount of push for marketing and selling its capabilities, there's a danger in overhyping it also.
Yeah.
So I don't think the J35 is entirely what it is made out to be. Yes, it will turn out to be a potent platform over the years with more improvements and development, most certainly. But by then, I think even we'll have the AMCA. So this is like a cat and mouse game. So you bring one platform, that next one is more improvement. You bring a weapon system, you have a larger range, making it more capable. So this is a constant, I think, cat and mouse game, and nothing is the silver bullet they make it out to be.
Yeah. That's it for the day. I'm not taking any more questions to all those viewers because we are running out of time. And both of us have other commitments immediately after this. On behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank Marshal Choudhury for coming and spending this hour early in the morning with us. I thought it was a fantastic session. A lot of things opened up, and actually, we're leaving here with many unanswered questions. I'm aware of that. I'm leaving him with all these unanswered questions with the fact that he's going to come back maybe after 10, 15 days with some more issues which we will take up. And I'll request him to give me the subject because this is my habit in Gunner Shot. Anyone who comes on Gunner Shot comes with a subject and he speaks from his heart and his choice. It is not my choice. It is driven by people who speak. It is driven by people who ask questions from amongst the audience. And that's part of democratization of strategy and defense and national security affairs, which we in India as a growing power need to understand. Right? That's all I have to say. Your final words, and then we'll say Jai Hind to everyone.
Thank you, General Shankar. I think it's been an absolute pleasure. And I think the odds have improved in my favor. Last time I had 5 Army generals and 1 Air Force officer. I think now
it's 1-1.
1-1. Now I think the fair odds today. But it was an
fair.
absolute pleasure. And the reason I love talking to you and speaking on your channel is because I think AFR has lots to offer, not so well understood, and there are a lot of I think misperceptions and shibboleths of the past which we need to get past. And I think in the future we could probably look at how all the services and the AFR in a larger context
Yeah,
can come together. That is
yeah,
one
will.
aspect. From a joint perspective, another aspect which we don't give too much of credence to is the enormous scope of civil aviation, which also forms a part of air power of a nation. So, and that has a huge overlap with your military capabilities as well.
Yeah,
So that is something we could probably discuss sometime in
yeah,
the
we
future.
should. We will, and that's what it is. Thanks a lot. I've had a great time, and I'm sure the audience also had a great time. With this, thank you. Morning, have a great day, and Jai Hind to all of you.
Jai Hind, sir. Thank you.
Time.